This series, Foundations in Faith, has been written for churches. Earlier documents that I have written targeted a more academic audience. This series is meant to be a tool for pastors and Bible teachers to use to build confidence in the Bible through a better understanding of archaeology and history. I want to emphasize that this series is built on the latest research along with original research, and it uses a fresh approach to teaching history. It's not just an old rehashing of old ideas that you've heard before. Part 1 traces the history of the problem, beginning with a popular acceptance of Egyptian history that has replaced biblical history. It continues by showing how it was Egyptian history that has led to increasing the age of the earth, which we call deep time, and has subsequently led to the theory of evolution, which has had a devastating influence on our culture. Our culture has changed to accept behaviors that were unacceptable in the past. In 1973, Roe v. Wade made abortions legal in the United States. By 2015, same-sex marriages became legal in all 50 states. Woke and DEI agendas are being spread by the major institutions of our society. Have you noticed that felonies are being changed to misdemeanors? And Charlie Kirk was led to write Pagan Threat because of the growth of paganism in America. This leads us to ask the question, why? Why is the American culture abandoning Christian values? We also ask, why has our culture essentially adopted deism, which is the belief that God does not intervene in the universe? Most people have no idea how these changes got started. Our culture has changed because our understanding of history has gradually changed over centuries. History, as we once knew it, has been rewritten. Originally, in Europe and the United States, both Catholic and Protestant theology taught the Old Testament as true history. Today, colleges teach the history of Egypt without referring to Israel and Egypt, the Exodus, and the conquest of Canaan. History is taught as if God were not present and miracles never happened. Academic history excludes any mention of a miracle-working God. We really need to ask, how did this happen? Why did history change? History changed because the age of the earth changed. Now we're getting closer to the root of the problem. When we study the facts, we discover that the age of the earth changed first. First, people believed the earth was older than the Bible said it was. That then changed their interpretation of history. Then, when history changed, it changed our culture. It went in that order. As long as people believed that the earth was young, it was easy to believe that God directly caused creation, the flood, the Exodus, etc. As the age of the earth increased, faith in miracles decreased. An old earth doesn't need God and doesn't need miracles. But what then caused the age of the earth to change? 2 Thessalonians 2:3 says that there will be a great falling away or apocalypse in the last days. While progressives see this change as progress, Christians see it as a harbinger of the apocalypse. This idea is not new, but when did it really begin? It didn't begin with Darwin in the 19th century. He just codified one part of it. It didn't begin with science because no scientific experiment proved it. We will see that it began with trusting pagan sources over the Bible. It began with wrong assumptions that should have been called out. It began with bad and deceptive logic. The great falling away from the Christian faith didn't begin in the 19th century. It began much earlier. Let's look at the 18th century. The intellectual rebellion known as the Enlightenment got underway in France, and it led to the French Revolution in 1789. French writers included Bernard de Fontenelle, Benoit de Maillet, Comte de Buffon, and Voltaire. These men were strongly influenced by the Hindu religion and by Greek paganism, which is where they got the idea of deep time to replace the creation story. The French Revolution got a bad reputation in England, so English writers tried to distance themselves from the pagan religious sources of the French and to appear more secular. English writers included David Hume, Erasmus Darwin, James Hutton, Charles Lyell, and Charles Darwin. The pagan religious influence of the 1700s is well documented, but few people talk about what happened much earlier in 1606. In 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire, and Greek scholars introduced many very old manuscripts to Europeans in the West. This was a pivotal event. Joseph Scaliger was a French Huguenot scholar who is remembered for introducing Jewish and Egyptian literature into the Renaissance movement, which used mostly Latin and Greek texts up to that time. In 1606, Scaliger published an encyclopedia of chronology that included writings of Eusebius, who quoted Manetho from the 3rd century BC. That means that the ideas of Manetho were already 1900 years old when he published them. Here's the problem. When all Egyptian dynasties were put end to end, the oldest Egyptian dynasty went back to 5285 BC, which was before Adam and before the creation according to the genealogies of Genesis. One man, Manetho, caused history of human origins to be rewritten.
Imagine if everything you think you know about ancient Egypt's timeline came from one person you've never met. Manetho, an Egyptian priest living around the 3rd century BCE, who basically organized pharaohs like a playlist. I'm going to jump from pyramids to Ptolemies and back again, and by the end you'll know why historians still argue with a guy who's been dead for over 2,000 years. He wrote in Greek for a Greek reading world, and his big project, the Egyptiaca, tried to turn messy royal memory into a clean story. His trick? Dynasties, about 30 of them. Sounds tidy, right? Here's the twist. We don't actually have his book. What we have are later quotes and summaries. Josephus Africanus, Eusebius, and others, like hearing a rumor retold at 3 different parties. That's why Manetho is both essential and slippery. He preserves names we'd otherwise lose, hints at odd episodes, the Shepherd Kings, most likely the Hyksos, and gives spans of reigns that seem precise, until they're not. Sometimes it trips over the sand. So why do I still trust him? Carefully, because his dynasties map surprisingly well onto monuments, inscriptions, and king lists carved in stone. When new tombs and papyri surface, Manetho's scaffold often holds. When it doesn't, we adjust the scaffold, not the ruins. Here's your timeline tease. Old Kingdom pyramids, that's his 3rd to 6th dynasties. Middle Kingdom art bloom, 11th to 12th. New Kingdom power flex, Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tut-Ramses, 18th through 20th. If you've ever sorted Egypt into those eras, you're using Manetho's frame. So, one priest, one lost book, and a structure that still shapes how I read the Nile's past. Manetho didn't give us certainty. He gave us a system and a mystery that keeps history alive.
What can I say? Manetho lied. The Bible doesn't. Everyone knows that Manetho made mistakes and exaggerated, such as 70 kings who ruled for 70 days each. No one believes that was true. Even his sources that we can find disagree among themselves. Egyptian history contains truth, but it isn't perfect. We also know that Manetho had an agenda. He hated the Jews, and he didn't believe the Exodus had taken place. Why would we expect anything else? He was an Egyptian. He also wanted to make Egyptian history as old as possible to earn the respect of the Greeks. The Bible warns over and over not to trust Egypt because its teachings will lead you astray. Egypt is a broken reed. If you try to lean on it, it will pierce through your hand. Egyptian chronology contradicts biblical chronology. They can't both be true. This is the most foundational issue between Christianity and secularism. It's also a very sensitive issue within churches, one that is largely avoided. It's the elephant in the room. Theology has lost its historical foundation. Today's theology is based more on linguistics and logic than on reality. Christian leaders once denounced Egyptian history as a lie, but they slowly capitulated. Learn how they gave in, and you'll be better able to stand for the truth. Josephus and Eusebius knew about Manetho. Just because he was known doesn't mean that people believed what he wrote. For example, Augustine of Hippo called him a liar. On page 390 of The City of God, he wrote, "They are deceived, too, by these highly mendacious documents, which profess to give the history of many thousand years, though, reckoning by the sacred writing, we find that not 6,000 years have yet passed." Christians also responded when Manetho was published in Europe. James Lightfoot published a meticulous study of the genealogies of the Bible, arriving at a creation date of 4004 BC. In fact, he calculated that the first day of creation was on October 23rd of that year. This he did just 36 years after Manetho's chronology was published, so it's hard to imagine that he did not know what was going on and was responding to obvious error. The same can be said of Bishop James Ussher, who independently arrived at the same creation date, 4004 BC. Most people didn't realize that Sir Isaac Newton was a serious student of history and wrote The Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended. In it, he also calculated the date of creation as 4004 BC. It's interesting to note that Newton, who was somewhere between an Orthodox Christian and a deist, trusted the Bible over Manetho. He considered the Bible to be a book of historical facts that could be used to date the earth. On the other hand, less scrupulous people were drawn to imaginative interpretations of the Bible in their efforts to oppose institutional religion. They were willing to throw out the baby with the bathwater. One clear example was Isaac de la Peyrère. 50 years after Scaliger, he wrote a book called Men Before Adam. In it, he declared that Adam was not the father of all men, although somehow the Jews were supposed to have descended from Adam. That makes little sense and isn't even possible. You can see from the secondary title, A Discourse upon the 12th, 13th, and 14th verses of the 5th chapter of the Epistle of the Apostle Paul to the Romans. In other words, his argument was based upon the phrase, those who had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. Now, I ask you, who today would read that phrase in Romans and conclude from it that Adam was not the first man? Even though this book was officially condemned, it shows the recklessness of popular thinking in that day. Let's review the pre-Adamite logic. First, the pre-Adamites believed that Egyptian dynasties were older than Adam, so there were people before Adam. Of course, they were wrong. So if people lived before Adam, then the creation of the earth took place long before the creation of Adam. There was more than one creation. So the earth itself is older than 4004 BC. The real problem is that once the Bible ceases to be an absolute boundary for truth, then it has to conform to whatever science declares to be true. Toward the end of the 18th century, a little pseudoscience was added to the pre-Adamite insanity. This came through Georges Louis Leclerc, who inherited a large fortune at the age of 7. This allowed the purchase of an estate in Burgundy, France, which was large enough to be declared a county, which made him a count. Since it was near the village of Buffon, he became the Comte de Buffon. Although he was brilliant, I consider him a rich and spoiled aristocrat who got in trouble for criticizing biblical creation and whose son was guillotined by the French Revolution. Buffon was either a deist or secretly an atheist. Now, the Count had a foundry on his property. As he observed the molten metal being poured, he speculated that the earth started as a piece of the sun and cooled down over time. He calculated that it would take 75,000 years for molten metal from the sun to cool down enough to become the earth. Much later, Lord Kelvin did similar calculations and determined that the earth could not be more than 20 to 40 million years old. This Kelvin did, though, as an old earth creationist to disprove Darwin's theory of evolution and to refute the geologist's claim that the earth is billions of years old. Buffon rejected creation, but had no scientific reason to believe that the earth came from the sun. In fact, the sun is 90% hydrogen atoms and the earth is not. When hydrogen cools, it doesn't turn into dirt. Today, no one believes that the earth came from a piece of the sun. They believe that the earth formed from pieces of minerals that came from an unknown source in heaven. All the right elements had to be available in the right amounts to create the earth we have today. That's as much a miracle as creation. Did you know that the sun, in fact, no sun, is hot enough to produce elements heavier than iron? That means that every time you see copper, tin, zinc, lead, gold, or silver, you're looking at a miracle. Just because metal cools down doesn't mean the earth did. A mathematical formula is not observation. So far, we've seen pagan thinking, not science. The 19th century assumed a deep time, but no one proved it. The debate was over the flood. Could we find any evidence of a global flood in rocks? Unfortunately, everyone was looking for a flood layer while ignoring the fact that the entire geologic column was laid down by the flood. They couldn't see the forest for the trees. Charles Lyell in England led a group known as the Diluvialists. He was a geologist. He only saw small, slow changes over billions of years. He couldn't find a layer of rock that looked like a global flood. Georges Cuvier in France led a group known as the Diluvialists. He was the father of paleontology and was an expert at comparing living animals with fossils. Cuvier, like Lyell, believed that layers of rock had been laid down over billions of years, but that several floods wiped out certain species and God created new species. The last flood would have been Noah's flood. Cuvier died in 1832, which gave Lyell the advantage. There was still much resistance against the idea of prehistoric man, even though European colonialists wanted to believe that Africans came from an inferior ancestor. Men were looking for proof for people before Adam. One event changed everything. In 1859, Joseph Prestwich confirmed that he had found human remains in the same strata as extinct animals in Amiens and Abbeville, France, and in Hoxne, England. It ruled out the scenario that mammoths died in the flood, then God created Adam. This was bad logic, but it silenced the Diluvialists. On May 26, Prestwich presented his evidence to the semi-official Royal Society of London, and it was accepted. The news spread like wildfire. It was a small step for Charles Darwin to get his book published, and his ideas of human evolution accepted the same year. There was no strong voice to speak out against growing popular opinion. Charles Lyell, the geologist, was the father of geologic evolution. It involved slow change over billions of years and no catastrophic global flood. Charles Darwin, the naturalist, was the father of biological and human evolution. It involved slow change over billions of years, no flood, and no Adam and Eve. Non-living matter came to life and naturally became humans. Key leaders bought into it, and fierce proponents such as Aldous Huxley debated to put down all opposition. Let's review the logic that shaped the end of the 19th century. First of all, there was no opposition to the idea of deep time. Of course, many Christians resisted the idea that they came from apes, but churches largely went silent around 1850, according to Terry Mortensen. That's when we find the last creationist writings. Secondly, people assumed that Noah's flood separated mammoths from people. This was a straw man argument and bad logic because creationists today don't believe that. We believe that people lived with mammoths for centuries after the flood. Thirdly, humans were found with extinct animals, but it proved nothing. It was used as propaganda to silence those who defended the flood. As a result, the public was duped into believing that there are ancient humans and no flood. Christians have gone silent in many venues where they could speak up, but that doesn't mean that you need to be silent. God is looking for a man or a woman to stand in the gap. All you have to tell them is, I believe the Bible. All of it. I believe in creation, Adam and Eve, the global flood, Babel, the Exodus, the conquest, Israel, the resurrection. I believe the mighty works of God. If you can't answer their objections, then study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. If you're not sure that you believe everything in the Bible, then join us as we continue to bring supporting facts from science, archaeology, and history. This series demonstrated that religion and not science is behind the origin of the old Earth beliefs. Next, we want to ask if the bold claims of radiometric dating are justified by science. Then, we want to show that all historical events fit within a young Earth timeline better than within an old Earth timeline. In fact, God's mighty works really shine when they are placed in the correct timeline.